Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 30. You've got some nerve, boy. Although the lieutenant spent the last hour trying to think of a way to get himself out of his present mess, nothing came to mind. All the evidence was there, laid out on the forward command office desk for anyone to see. The map, the plans, the list of supplies, the timetable, his own handwriting scrawling out his conviction. According to the major, he was guilty of plotting against the general and the army of Idumea. He left without permission, he had stolen a pack horse, he was going against the orders of the commanding officer of the fort, and he had lied to enlisted men. He sat on the hard chair, his hands and feet shackled in chains, and stared at the floor desperately trying to think of anything. But his mind was blank as he listened to the muffled arguing going on in the command office. Twig and Healy were discussing his situation, but the lieutenant couldn't make out any of the words. Neither of the men were happy, though, that much was obvious. The lieutenant glanced at the door, but quickly looked down again to avoid the sniggers of the 6 guards posted around him, their swords drawn, just waiting for the lieutenant to make another dumb move. Dumb. He tried not to think about the word, but it really was the only one that fit. He should have been more cautious. He should have taken a less obvious route, but there really wasn't any other route. Then again, who'd be traveling so early in the morning anyway? It was as if they knew somehow. Healy's voice came louder again through the closed door, and the lieutenant's chest burned with anger. It was all his fault. Healy didn't want the lieutenant to go by himself and bring home all the glory, so he had him watched and followed. All Healy had to do was forget the lieutenant ever talked to him yesterday, but no. The stupid old man, who should have died last year anyway, had to play Thorn's little faithful dog and bring his master a bone. Maybe this was vengeance for the lieutenant calling him weak. Well, he just proved it, didn't he? So weak that he has to run tattling like a 4-year-old to the major. Stupid old man. All of them. There was wisdom in eliminating the older generation. Too bad they didn't get rid of every last one of them. The command office door flung open to reveal Twig and Healy, both red-faced. He glared back defiantly. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Twig demanded. "Is this an inquiry?" "Not yet." "Then I have nothing to say yet." Twig stepped closer and leaned to within inches of his face. "Nothing to say? I find that exceptionally hard to believe." The lieutenant stared past him. Twig straightened his back. "But you will stand for your crimes against the general and the army in 3 days." That caught the lieutenant off guard. Thorn would be there in just days? "Yes," Twig said, a smug smile developing on his taut face. "While the army will be here on the 29th, Thorn will be here day after tomorrow. He wants to begin his search for the unknown village immediately by questioning some people. But I'm sure he'll find time to conduct your inquiry. In the meantime, think about what you'll say in your defense while you spend the next few days in confinement at the incarceration building in Edge." The lieutenant didn't know what was more startling, the fact that Thorn would be there soon, or that he was going to be locked up. He looked over to Healy imploringly. Healy tipped his head. "Did you really think we're going to let you stay at the mansion after this? As if Slither could control you." Speechless, the lieutenant only blinked in surprise. "You've got some nerve, boy. After everything everyone has done for you. I've got nothing more to say to you." Healy motioned to the guards. "Take him to incarceration." The lieutenant was too stunned to say or do anything, as 2 guards roughly pulled him out of the chair. He stumbled a little, but was yanked into a standing position by another guard. Affronted by his brutishness, the lieutenant shouted, "Hey!" But the guard smacked him across the face. "No talking." The lieutenant, infuriated, looked over at Twig and Healy, fully expecting them to admonish the guard for his behavior. But neither of the men moved to his defense. They only nodded at the guards to continue on. One of them shoved the lieutenant, and he barely caught himself before he stumbled down the stairs. That's when he realized he'd messed up. Big. And this time, there was no one rushing to his defense. No friends in the fort to speak for him. Onus was dead, Croup was gone, and now Healy had regarded him with severe disappointment. The lieutenant reached the bottom of the stairs and was greeted by everyone's stares. "Make way for the criminal, the betrayer of General Thorne," shouted one of the guards, a bit too gleefully, as he pushed him along. The lieutenant groaned as he heard half a dozen whispered conversations erupt around him. He wasn't a criminal, and he certainly didn't betray the general. He really hadn't done anything except take an early morning ride. But saying so would only earn him another smack across the face. He stepped out into the compound, keeping his eyes on the ground, but still feeling stares as every soldier getting ready for his morning shift stopped and watched the lieutenant, shackled hand and foot. One of the guards grabbed his arm, as if the lieutenant had the ability to run away, and pulled him over to a wagon. He struggled to climb up, but a kick in the rump from another guard helped him along. He stared numbly at the bottom of the wagon while the rest of the guards climbed around him. Something was different about the day, the lieutenant noticed. He saw his shadow. Not faint and vague as on other days when the sun struggled to burn through the murky air, but a distinctly sharp shadow. The sun was out, fully out, and shining brightly. He'd noticed it earlier, but his observation of the change in the weather was abruptly halted by the soldiers who stopped his progress. The air, too, felt different, warmer. As the wagon lurched on its way out of the compound, the lieutenant took a deep breath. The air smelled clear and promising, like early planting season air usually did. He didn't have time to think about what that might mean, because the wagon now pulled out of the compound and was headed south into Edge. "Make way for the criminal," one of the guards shouted happily to whoever might be walking along the roads. "The betrayer of General Thorne." There were lots of people along the roads. Everyone, it seemed, had come outside to experience the first true sunshine in moons. Facing east and smiling at the light, nearly every villager littered the roads. The lieutenant sighed quietly and grumbled under his breath. Great, just great. Now everyone in Edge would see him. No, that was great, he decided. They'd be upset to see his mistreatment. They'd rally to his aid when the time was right. The people of Edge would still be behind him. He lifted up his head to peer between the guards. Only a couple people could be bothered to pay attention as the wagon rolled by. It was blocking their sunlight, after all. One man sneered. Another man shook his head disapprovingly. A young woman merely glanced over at him, then continued to gaze at the brilliant sphere of white in the sky. The lieutenant bit his lip in worry. She always flirted with him. Maybe she didn't recognize him. Wait a minute. How could she not recognize him? No one sat taller in the wagon than him. No one looked remotely like him. They came to another intersection, and the guard again shouted his announcement. Once more the lieutenant looked eagerly around to see if any of the citizens would notice him. Nothing. No one cared. Or maybe they did care but couldn't show it. Why would they risk drawing the attention of the guards? The lieutenant could understand that. These people had been through so much. Of course they'd be concerned about self-preservation. Or maybe they were just too distracted by the light. Bad timing that he'd be hauled away on the first sunny day in half a year. After a few more roads and a few more announcements from guards, and more impassive and even irritated looks from citizens, the wagon came to a stop in front of a plain block building. A soldier came out of the building with raised eyebrows. "Well, what do we have here?" The driver of the wagon handed him a note, and the soldier smirked. The little lieutenant himself. Well, what do you know? I haven't had such an interesting prisoner in years. I have just the spot for him." The lieutenant tried to keep his face set. To know that people in Edge had a nickname for him was one thing, but to hear it said so derisively caught him off guard. A few minutes later, the lieutenant, minus his chains, was installed in his new room. It was constructed of block, a few inches shorter than he was, so he couldn't stand up straight. A board with a thin piece of cloth over it served as his bed, which was also a few inches too short, and a small hole in the ground of the opposite corner of the tiny room emitted such a stench that he knew exactly what its purpose was. The narrow door, which he was shoved through, was now shut with a loud thud. The small window, latticed in iron bars in the oak door, was the only source of dim light from the hallway. Up until that moment, the lieutenant remained defiant and proud. But now that he was alone, completely alone, he felt terror that he hadn't experienced since he was trapped in the ashfall during the eruption. Panic swept through him as he realized there was no escape. Instinctively, he rushed for the door, trying to rattle it, hoping for some give, but the solid wood wouldn't budge. He looked frantically around, remembering that Healy had said one could still glimpse the sun from the incarceration building, but there were no other cracks where the brilliant light could come through. The lieutenant began to breathe harder and faster, feeling as if the tiny room was growing smaller by the moment. "No, no, no, no," he whispered, trying to shake the door again. He peered through the bars, hoping to see something, but there was only faint light coming from another room somewhere. Everything was dark, cramped, and foul. The room felt now like a coffin, closing in with isolation and despair, and he felt the irrational need to push against the wall to keep it from engulfing him. He panted as he pushed, trying to ensure that the wall stayed up, but it was no use. He had no power to change anything. His strength failed, as did his hope. Helpless, he slid along the wall to the filthy ground, and his shoulders began to shake. Tears slid down his face, and, like a child, he held his head in his hands and sobbed. Pato stood outside of his house in the back garden, his arms outstretched in a stance almost akin to worship as he faced east. He was nearly overcome with the strongest urge to take off his coat, shirt, and undershirt to expose as much of his skin as he could to the bright sun that was rising above the mountains that ringed Salem. But Rector Shin restrained himself. He knew that his wife, mother, and children were watching him from the windows and likely giggling. The sky was blue that morning, a true blue. The sun was blinding, an actual burning sphere that produced just the smallest amount of heat. But it was enough. Pato had to drink it all in. He couldn't abide sitting at the breakfast table with his family a moment longer, allowing the glorious morning to go to waste. Lilla had assured him they'd all be out in a minute to welcome back the sun with him, but that wasn't good enough. What if another hazy cloud came by in the meantime? So he stood out there with his eyes closed, breathing in deeply the air that tasted like planting season, and thanking the Creator for something different. He grinned as he felt the sun and the Creator tell him, "You are welcome." Then suddenly, the sun lost its tiny amount of warmth. Pato squinted open his eyes to peer at it. It was still shining, but bizarrely no longer shone on him. He pulled in his arms and felt as if he was enclosed somehow, as if everything was crushing around him. His breathing quickened as a sense of terror, of darkness, of loneliness overwhelmed him. He could no longer stand, but crumpled to his knees. A tremendous wave of remorse engulfed him. "Dear Creator," he gasped, "forgive me, what have I done?" As he gripped his head in his hands, the words came clearly to his mind. It's not you. It's your son, so that you will understand. Just as quickly as the darkness overcame him, it left, and the sun warmed his face again. Cautiously, Peto looked up and saw blue skies. Behind him, a door slammed, and Lilla rushed to him. Peto, are you all right? I saw you go down and... Yes, he assured her as he tried to get to his feet. He didn't know how to tell her. I know, she whispered fretfully. It's young Pear, isn't he? He's done something stupid. Very big and very stupid. I felt it a moment ago. As if he's in a box of some kind. Like an incarceration cell? Lilla narrowed her eyes. I've heard that phrase before, but I don't remember what it means. What is that? It means he can't cause any more trouble for a while. His wife began to tremble. It's not as good as you're trying to make it sound, is it? Time moves strangely when one sees no light. Maybe it doesn't move at all. Maybe it stops, just like everything else. No light, no time, no feeling, no thought, no sense, no direction. The lieutenant sat there hour after hour, or maybe just minute after minute. Sometimes he sobbed. Sometimes he whispered, nothing of importance. Sometimes he hummed tunelessly. He wasn't even sure what the slop on the wooden board was when it came in the evening, but he knew he had to eat it. The water in his mug tasted off, but he realized he had no other options. He waited. Keeping his mind from thinking was the hardest thing to do. Each time a thought of what he should have done, or what might happen to him, flashed into his mind, he shoved it away and rocked back and forth. He was growing sick with waiting, but he knew that wouldn't help him either. Only one person came to see him, the very man he did not want to see, and he refused to look at him when he came by that night. How are you doing, Thorne? Sergeant Major Healy said amiably through the barred window in the door. How was he doing? He actually had the nerve to ask him how he was doing. The lieutenant refused to answer. He heard the locks in the door working and saw out of the corner of his eye the sergeant major coming through the door. It shut behind him loudly. So, what do you think of the food here? Healy said. Heard the cook used to work at Edge's Inn for about 10 minutes. The lieutenant didn't smile, but stared at the wall. Healy nodded slowly. I understand. I really do. You'd be surprised how well I understand. The lieutenant continued to stare. Phew, smell hasn't changed in all these years, Healy commented. Amazing how scents stay with you. Such persistent memories. The lieutenant didn't move. Should you need anything, Lek, anything at all, let the guards know. Healy put his hand on his back. Most of them owe me favors. The lieutenant pulled away from his touch. Understand. Someday you'll understand too. Then he left. It wasn't soon enough. The next morning, the lieutenant's remaining bravado, rage, and frustration were crushed by the walls. When he woke up on the hard board, chilled because of the inadequacy of the blanket, it all came down on him. He was a complete failure. He felt as low and as stupid as he did the first night in the world, when he lost everything in one brainless night, dancing to the drums and laying with a sow. But somehow, this was even worse. Maybe it was because he wasn't so naive anymore. Maybe because he knew precisely what he was doing and refused to believe he really wasn't in control of anything. He had to believe it now. No one cared about him. Even though Healy had visited him, he was likely to get a report to bring to Twig about how devastated the lieutenant was. If he showed up today, undoubtedly his report would bring even more amusement to the soldiers on duty. The soldiers who hated him. Everyone hated him. He heard the guards sniggering about the little lieutenant locked up in the center cell. He curled up on the board and stared at the block wall inches from his face. He studied the tiny grooves in the mortar and rock wall until his tears made it too blurry to focus. He was beyond help. No, he remembered something his father had said repeatedly as he stood in front of their congregation. No one is ever too far gone for their Creator to find them again. The lieutenant held on to that thought for a minute, 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, hoping that it might be true. The possibility left him nearly breathless with feathers of optimism, and if he exhaled too heavily, he'd blow the potential away. There was only one thing he could do, only one thing he had to do: ask for help. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and realized the futility of it. There were those who the Creator wanted to help, no doubt. Then there were the others. Others he'd promised to also help, but really didn't want to. But duty is duty. The lieutenant cringed. There was nothing worse than being pitied, except begging others to pity and rescue you. He didn't deserve rescue. He couldn't ask for it. It was too embarrassing. As he lay there on the board, an image came to his mind. He envisioned his family, all of them, including the married siblings and their children, at his parents' home. Years ago, Pugga had extended the eating room to accommodate the growing family, and 2 more tables were added. On holy days, not only did everyone come home to eat, but so did many others in the rectory. New refugees or neighbors, visiting families wanting to meet the Shins, or just old friends. There was always extra bodies for dinner, but that was all right. The rector's wife always cooked twice as much in anticipation. Lilla Shin's dinners were legendary. The lieutenant saw the feast, with people young and old packed around the tables. They were laughing, passing food, and carrying on loud conversations. Someone new came to the door and was eagerly shown in. Plates were squeezed in a little tighter, another chair was forced in, and the newcomer laden with food. Then the lieutenant imagined himself at the door, looking in, and the conversation at the table silenced. No one moved but stared at him in the doorway. "Oh," said someone in a monotone. "Forgot about that one." Instead of eagerly making room, each person looked uncomfortably at their neighbor. Someone cleared their throat, someone else coughed, and Rector Shin stood up. "Well, we probably can make room again," he said, in the same tone the lieutenant used whenever forced to allow a younger brother or cousin to join in a game. Clearly not wanted, but it was Salem's duty to never turn someone away. The lieutenant squeezed his eyes shut tighter, but still remained the image of his family and neighbors grudgingly sliding to make room for him. They didn't want him, yet they couldn't turn him away. His presence had ruined the evening. He wouldn't do it. Just as he wouldn't force his presence at his parents' home, neither would he pester the Creator with the pleas of a stupid son. He put himself there. He'd have to stay there. Eventually, they'd need the space for an even more important criminal, and they'd toss him out somewhere else to... Well, what did they do with the slag no one wanted? All this time around swordsmiths and metal workers at the fort, and he had no idea what they did with the useless cast-off lumps. They just seemed to vanish away. He wished he could have vanished. Instead, he lay there all day until the evening, when he heard the voice again. "Hello, Lek," Healy said kindly, as he came through the door again. He sat down next to the lieutenant on the small cot. The lieutenant slid closer to the wall, wishing he could become part of the block. Healy sighed. "I didn't want to have to do this, Lek. I promise. I was trying to save you from yourself, from your impulsiveness. I set up the catch because, believe it or not, I care about you. I consider you a friend, and I didn't want to see my friend destroy his future." The lieutenant almost opened his mouth at that, but he didn't know what to say. He had no friends. Healy's purpose was simply information gathering, and the lieutenant had nothing to offer. Why they didn't just eliminate him now, he couldn't understand. "So, the sun's out again," Healy said to break the silence. "I thought it might make things outside cheerier, but I promise you're not missing much. It's still cold. The ground's hard as a rock. The village is as dingy as ever, and the sky just isn't properly blue." Something caught in his throat as he said that. "Been a long time since I looked at the color of the sky," he murmured. "Hasn't been blue for a long time, and it still isn't. Yet still we claim that it is. How ludicrous is that? Why did I never notice that before?" The lieutenant said nothing. The color of the sky seemed to be a strange thing to worry about right now. Healy patted his thigh. "Can I get you anything? Blanket? Pillow?" The lieutenant stared at the wall. "Understood," Healy said quietly, and went on his way. Still, a small pillow and a thicker blanket were tossed in the cell before bedtime. The next day the door unlatched earlier. The lieutenant didn't know what he should expect, but it must have been close to the time he would be tossed out into the slag heap. This would have been the day the general was to come back, and the lieutenant thought perhaps it was better if he could vanish before facing him. Healy came into the cell with an apologetic look on his face. "Lek, Thorne's returned. I'm sorry, but he doesn't want you out yet." The lieutenant bit his lip. He didn't know what to make of that development. In a low voice, Healy said, "To put it mildly, he's furious. It's likely a good idea that you remain here, or you might not live to see the morning. I've seen the general when he's like this, and there's simply no reasoning with him. I'll do what I can for you, but—" He shrugged helplessly. The lieutenant turned away to the wall again, too despondent to know how to respond. "I'm trying, Lek," Healy said again, almost pleadingly. "Please, I really am trying." He didn't know why Healy bothered. He actually seemed to be sorry the lieutenant was incarcerated. The fact that the sergeant major showed up each day only filled the lieutenant with regret that Poe felt some odd compulsion to visit him. That last day was the longest day, even though the past days were fantastically dreadful. He watched the small window, waiting, still unsure of what he'd say when he was finally freed and faced the general. Eventually the door opened, and the board with his undefinable food came in again, and he realized that Healy hadn't been by to visit him. He watched the door all night, drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep, bracing himself for when it would fly open and he'd face, and that thought filled him with more fear than any other. He'd never paid attention to the criminal proceedings in the world. Now he wished he knew something. All the things he had avoided thinking about for the past 4 days plagued him during the night. What would happen to him next? He pondered again what he should have done, but every scenario failed because he never anticipated that Thorne would return to Edge early. He came to question people. That's what Twig said. But who? Amory. Amory might tell him everything. Maybe that's why no one came to get him. Maybe Thorne realized that his son wasn't his son after all, so he was going to leave the little Zenas upstart to rot in the cell. No one in Salem would know what happened to him. He'd never know what happened to Salem. He remained on his side in the tiny room, curled up in a ball. Eventually, the dim light began to return to the window and the door. He waited for his morning meal, but it didn't come. He rocked until he heard voices. He scrambled to his feet and tried to smooth out his filthy jacket. The door swung open to reveal soldiers. "Get him cleaned up," came an unfamiliar voice. "Washed, shaved, brush out that jacket, too. He needs to be presentable." "For what?" he responded nervously, startled to hear his own voice after so many days of silence. One of the soldiers reached in the cell and pulled him out, but he went as willingly as he could. "They always smell so bad when they come out of there, don't they?" said one of the guards, prodding him down a narrow, dank corridor. like a forgotten sow. His legs, stiff from disuse, did their best to keep moving, but he stumbled as he went. The corridor opened to a larger room with narrow windows high up on the walls that let in a little light. In the middle of the room was a large trough filled with water. "Take off your clothes, get in, and scrub up," one of the guards ordered as they pushed him toward it. "Give me your jacket, as if anything can be done with this." He quickly took off his jacket and handed it over, then willingly removed the rest of his clothing. He didn't care that the water was cold, he just wanted to get the stench off of him. When he finished washing, he noticed a set of clothing folded on a chair. "Those are yours, supposedly," said one of the guards. "Sent over from the mansion. You'll go without your jacket. That will take longer to clean." "Where am I going?" he asked submissively, as he used a thin cloth to dry himself. The guards only sneered as they watched him hurriedly dress. It felt strange to put on clean clothing and his white undershirt. His trousers felt almost stiff, and even though he felt underdressed without his jacket, he felt almost like a new man. They led him over to a scratched mirror and monitored him closely as he shaved himself, making sure he didn't attempt to use the blade for anything else. He avoided looking into his eyes, too worried about what he might see, but ran his fingers through his wet hair that needed a trim and hoped he looked acceptable. But for what? Nervously, he nodded to the guards that he was ready, but one of them motioned for him to hold out his arms. He obediently held them out, and the chains were clapped around his wrists and legs. So much for a new man. He felt like an animal. A dumb, useless animal, fit for nothing but to be slaughtered. Bothering to have him cleaned up seemed like a waste of water. They led him out of the building into the blinding light of the morning. The sun still shone brightly and the sky was blue, a real blue. He almost gasped at the intensity of it. After 4 days of dim nothing, it was as if he'd never seen such colors before. But the air was cold, and he shivered in his thin shirt and wet hair as he climbed clumsily into the wagon, surrounded again by guards. Their bodies did little to break the cold wind that chilled him, but at least the air smelled clean. He glanced anxiously around as the wagon made its way to the fort. He wondered if he should be memorizing the mountains, or noticing that there was one tree that was trying to bud, because it might be the last time he ever saw such things. He wondered about the date, the 9th day of planting, right? Was this his last day? Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something as the wagon plodded along. Ruins. They were there where the second house on the road should have been, but the house had been burned down years ago. He knew what it was, yet had always ignored it, like a spider bite begging to be scratched, but he tried to pretend it wasn't there. It was their house, the one Mugga had purchased, the one Pugga had added rooms to for his children, the one that had burned to the ground sometime after they'd left. Today the melting snows revealed the stone foundation, gray and tan rocks fitted on top of each other, still holding firm. In weeding season, he'd seen explosions of wildflowers there, and a couple of trees even grew up from the middle of what likely had been the eating and gathering room. He glimpsed the ruins only for a moment, the foundation impressing deeply into his mind because it was still there. Everything else had burned away, but someone could still have gone to that site today, cleared out the vegetation, and constructed a solid house on top of that foundation that remained firm. He knew that was supposed to mean something, that his gaze had been directed to the site as they drove past, but right now he was too anxious to think more on it. He swallowed hard as the wagon turned for the fort to a side road that led directly to the mansion. He couldn't tell if it was a promising development or not. The last execution occurred on the front steps, but he wasn't facing execution, was he? He couldn't be. He breathed only slightly easier when he saw there were no more than the regular guards stationed at the front door. The wagon pulled up to a service door, and the guards yanked him out. The door opened, he was shoved through it, down the back hall, and soon found himself in the grand eating room of the mansion. General Thorne sat in his regular chair at his breakfast. Without looking up, he said casually, "The rest of you wait outside." The lieutenant felt exposed and vulnerable as he stood in the corner of the large room, every mirror along the walls reflecting the chains that bound him hand and foot. Professor Slither sat in another chair, also refusing to look at him, but focused intently on a piece of bread. The lieutenant continued to stand, trying to control his trembling, as he waited patiently for what was going to come next. Finally, General Thorne spoke. "So, I come home expecting to find my son," he said with a snarl, while he still fixated on his breakfast, "eagerly awaiting my return, that he'd be excited and willing to take on the command of 1,000 men, an unheard-of opportunity for such a young man. But instead," he looked up at the lieutenant with dead eyes, "I receive a report that my son, Lek Thorne, was sitting in the innermost cell of incarceration." The lieutenant swallowed, unsure if he should say anything. "No, I told them at the fort," Thorne continued with a fake smile on his face. "That can't be right. My son, the devoted, hard-working favorite son of Edge, in trouble? He wouldn't do that to me, to his name. But, Lek, I was wrong." He reached behind him and pulled a stack of papers from off a chair. The lieutenant winced as he recognized his notes, which the general dropped casually in front of him. "You see, Lek, I'm rarely wrong. There's nothing I hate more than having my officers give me evidence that I am." The lieutenant continued to stand silently at attention, the chain too tight around his left wrist. Professor Slither went on examining his piece of bread as if it were the most interesting thing he'd ever laid eyes upon. "Fascinating stack of paper," I thought to myself, Thorne continued, "as I read each and every word yesterday. Maps, lists of supplies, timetables. You didn't expect me here until the 29th, isn't that right? And by then you'd be back, correct? To what? Greet me? Surprise me? Ah, but then..." Thorne pulled another sheet of paper from the bottom of the stack. "Just when I thought that perhaps your intentions weren't malicious or deceitful, just when I had myself convinced that you were trying to do something good for the world and your devoted father, I find this." General Thorne held up a small paper with several scrawls on it. The lieutenant's chest seized. That wasn't in the notes he had in his pack. It was in the fireplace. The one he didn't like because the evening had been so balmy. A piece of paper that should have been destroyed. "Tell me, Lek," Thorne quietly seethed as he turned to read it again. "Whose signature is this, practiced so carefully? Exactly who is General Perrin Shin? Someone I used to know, or someone I'm going to know?" The lieutenant didn't need to look at his reflection in the many mirrors to know he'd gone gray. He hadn't expected someone would search his room. Yet another thing he failed to consider before he headed off in a mad dash for the west. "I'm waiting for an answer, soldier," Thorne snapped. "Sir, it was just nothing," he burst out. "No meaning at all, just random scribbling. That's why it was to be burned." The general studied him. "You have no idea how much I want to believe you, Lek. But I can't ignore the fact that after I give you my name, give you a commission, give you a bedroom in my home, and give you my food to eat, you choose to take another man's name. His name." "Just my grandfather's, sir, just to see how it looked, but I didn't like it, sir. That's why I tossed that in the fireplace." Thorne grunted. Almost believable. "So why were you so intent on finding Terrap's land that you were willing to steal a horse and supplies to do so? That you were willing to abandon your duty and your education in this misguided quest?" To make you proud of me, sir," he stammered. To find the western lands without having to risk the lives of anyone else. To surprise you when you return to Edge, slagging Zanus liar, Thorn roared. The lieutenant jumped in surprise and clamped his jaw shut. How dare you fill my ears with such words, he said, standing up. After all I've done for you, after all my sacrifice and effort for you to teach you and train you, this is the thanks I get. Your lies? Crete, I should kill you myself right now. General, Slither hissed, finally speaking. You agreed. Yes, yes, Thorn spat at him. I know. He sat back down, his eyes fixed on the lieutenant. I know all too well how the village feels about the little lieutenant, he sneered. And even though the soldiers hate him, I know how it would look if I executed my own son. The general cocked his head to loosen a tight neck muscle. Fortunately for you, Lek, some in the army believe it'd be a bad idea to give you the punishment you have so thoughtlessly earned. This is time for hope and optimism, I've been told, and not for punishment and executions. Therefore, he said with his left shoulder twitching in irritation, you will live, if only to watch me succeed in finding this unknown village so that you can see the kind of man your father is, the kind of example you're choosing to dishonor. He picked up the paper with the signature of General Perrin Shin and crushed it into a ball in his left hand. The name you should have been practicing was General Lek Thorn, but that's a name I doubt you will ever write, except in your dreams. Yes, sir, the lieutenant whispered. And, sir, I am sorry. I didn't mean to. Shut up! Thorn raged. He closed his eyes and massaged his forehead. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Strange thing about fatherhood. Makes you remember so much of your own childhood. I suppose I should be flattered that you're as ambitious as I was as a young man. My goal at your age was to become a general, the youngest ever. I suppose it's a family trait that you would follow in those footsteps. But what you don't understand, he continued, in an oddly tranquil tone, his eyes still closed, is that my father was not the kind of father I am, Lek. He was cruel and heartless. He cared only for himself and his position. No one else mattered. I shed no tears when I heard that he was killed by the sergeant's army. As far as I know, neither did my mother. But I am not Cain Thorn, he said, opening his eyes and regarding the lieutenant with what could only be described as anguish. And I deserve to be treated better by my son. My disappointment in you is deep and bitter. But as I said, I am not Cain Thorn, and I could see myself eventually forgiving you of your crimes. That's what fathers do. At least, that's what the good ones do. He sighed. Oh, the timing of this is bad, Lek. I need you now more than ever, and instead you stand in my eating room in chains and smelling like a cesspool. I don't know what to do with you. I really don't. General, Slither began quietly. I know, Thorn hissed back at him. I know, he sighed again. It's been decided, Lieutenant Thorn, that you will continue to serve the army since every able-bodied man is needed for our search. It's also been decided that you'll be returned to the fort, stripped of your commission, and reinstated as a private. You'll be under the constant supervision of Sergeant Major Healy, and you will do nothing unless you first check with him. Eat, sleep, relieve yourself, nothing unless he gives you permission. Healy has been assigned to supervise the distribution of soldiers among commanders, as well as arrange for camp positions as the army arrives. He has 9 enlisted men helping him run his errands and keep his notes. You will be the 10th. You are nothing more than another private. Do you understand? The private, nodded. I've also chosen to strip you of your name. You'll return to the name of dishonor you so earnestly wrote on this, he said, throwing the balled-up paper into the fireplace. "You are Private Perrin Shin. I cannot deny that you are my flesh and blood, but I can deny you the privilege that goes with it. You now have to earn my name, boy. And once you have, you will also earn my forgiveness. You may still someday become Lieutenant Thorne, but I don't see that happening for a very long time. Until then, you'll be watched every moment, day and night, until you prove yourself again. But know this," Thorne said, pointing threateningly. "If you do anything at all, to embarrass me or this army, you will once again know the joys of solitary confinement, and 4 days will seem like a pleasant vacation. Anything more serious, you will never again see the light of day. Understood?" The private could do nothing more than nod. And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.